June 17, 1982, East New York, Brooklyn. At 6:42 a.m., Maria Salerno walked out of her apartment building on Crescent Street. She carried a small leather purse. No luggage. No note. Two black sedans idled across the street. A neighbor watched from behind lace curtains. Said she hesitated. Just for a second. Like she knew. Maria stepped off the curb. She never reached the corner. By noon, her name was already being erased. Phone disconnected. Mail collected. Landlord paid in cash. 3 days earlier, her husband, Anthony Salerno Jr., had entered federal custody. He was talking, not just about shylarks and bookmakers, about captains, about shipments, about money that crossed boroughs and borders. In the movies, when a man flips, the camera follows him. It never follows the wife. Maria did not vanish because she knew too much. She vanished because she knew enough, and because someone needed to send a message that cooperation spreads like infection. And infection must be cauterized. Maria Salerno was born in 1951 in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Second-generation Italian-American. Catholic school education. Quiet. Observant. Raised in a neighborhood where doors stayed unlocked and everyone knew who collected for whom. She met Anthony in 1968 at a church festival on Pitkin Avenue. He was charming without trying. Dark suit. Polished shoes. The kind of young man older men nodded at. Anthony did not look like a gangster. He looked employed. His father had worked sanitation. His uncle ran a small numbers operation out of a candy store. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just envelopes moving hands. Maria married into that rhythm. Their apartment in East New York was modest but precise. Plastic-covered couch. Framed wedding photo above the television. Sunday dinners at his mother's house. Sauce simmering for hours. Anthony left home every morning at 9:15. He said he managed vending routes. He never explained why he carried 2 beepers. Maria understood the rules without being told. Don't ask about cash. Don't answer unknown voices. Don't repeat what you hear through walls. In that world, women were not ignorant. They were compartmentalized. Maria handled groceries, church donations, and the small lies that kept neighbors comfortable. She signed for packages. She smiled when men in Cadillacs double-parked outside. She knew there were meetings in the back room of the social club on Liberty Avenue. She knew the names that weren't spoken in full sentences. But knowledge inside a Mafia household exists in layers. Anthony kept his public life affectionate. Flowers on anniversaries. Gold bracelet on her 30th birthday. Private life was different. Phone calls that ended mid-sentence. Sudden tension when certain names appeared on television news. The summer of 1980 brought something new: fear. The FBI had begun circling closer to Brooklyn's rackets. Anthony started locking drawers. Maria never confronted him. Not because she lacked courage. Because confrontation implied choice. And in that neighborhood, there was no choice. You married the man. You married the system. And the system never forgot who you belonged to. By 1982, Maria was not just a wife. She was proximity. And proximity, in organized crime, is liability. Anthony Salerno Jr. did not inherit power. He earned proximity. By the mid-1970s, Brooklyn's rackets were tightening under the quiet authority of the Lucchese crime family. The structure was disciplined, hierarchical, ruthless without spectacle. Boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers, associates. Anthony was never a made man. That mattered. He operated in the grey tier beneath ceremony, trusted, but not protected. His entry point was gambling. Sports books run out of storefronts that sold nothing. Number slips folded into cigarette packs. By 1977, he was overseeing vending machine routes that were less about candy bars and more about territorial control. Every machine inside a bar meant leverage. Every bar meant debt. He answered to a captain whose name rarely appeared in indictments but often surfaced in wiretaps. A quiet earner. Old school. The kind who believed visibility was weakness. Anthony's value was logistical. He moved cash without attracting pattern recognition. He knew which precinct officers could be persuaded, which union stewards needed envelopes at Christmas. Money flowed upward, always upward. The late 1970s were profitable years. Construction bids were manipulated. Concrete contracts rotated through controlled companies. The shadow of the five families loomed over the city's growth. Skyscrapers rose. So did tribute. Anthony tasted success in increments. A better apartment. A Cadillac leased under a cousin's name. Dinners at restaurants where the maître d' never asked for reservations. But inside the Lucchese hierarchy, advancement required sponsorship. And sponsorship required risk. He was allowed into rooms where decisions were discussed but not debated. He learned the language of deference. When to speak. When to nod. What he did not learn was insulation. In 1981, federal prosecutors began weaving together racketeering cases under the expanding force of RICO statutes. Surveillance intensified. Social clubs were wired. Associates were photographed entering buildings at odd hours. Anthony's captain reassured everyone. We've survived worse. But survival depended on silence. And silence depended on fear. Anthony was trusted with money, but not secrets at the highest tier. That distinction would soon determine his fate. Because when federal indictments began landing in Brooklyn, the hierarchy did what it always does. It sacrificed the reachable first. Anthony was reachable. And for the first time, proximity stopped feeling like power. It started feeling like exposure. The arrest came quietly. February 3, 1982. Federal agents waited outside a warehouse near Atlantic Avenue. No sirens. No spectacle. Just paperwork and certainty. Anthony was charged under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Conspiracy. Illegal gambling operations. Extortion. He expected bail. He did not expect the weight of evidence. Wiretaps. Ledger books. Surveillance photographs mapping his movements between social clubs and construction offices. Names that should have remained whispers were now typed in federal affidavits. In Brooklyn, arrests were routine. Convictions were survivable. But RICO changed the mathematics. Under President Ronald Reagan, federal prosecutors were encouraged to dismantle criminal enterprises, not just punish individuals. The strategy was surgical. Remove the structure, not the symptom. Anthony's captain assured him the family would handle legal expenses. That loyalty would be remembered. But jail compresses bravado. Weeks passed in pre-trial detention. Bail denied. Prosecutors hinted at a superseding indictment. one that could tie him to higher-ranking figures within the Lucchese crime family. 20 years became possible. Maria visited twice a week. She wore the same beige coat, spoke softly through reinforced glass. Anthony's public voice remained steady. "I'm fine. Don't worry." Private conversations with his attorney were different. The evidence was layered. Other defendants were wavering. One associate had already agreed to cooperate. Anthony began calculating. Not loyalty. Survival. In organized crime, flipping is not sudden betrayal. It is erosion. Sleep deprivation. Legal reality. The understanding that the hierarchy above you will not share your sentence. The captain stopped sending messages. Phone calls from the social club grew shorter. Anthony realized something fundamental. The structure he served had already adjusted to his absence. And so he made a decision that, inside that world, carries only one definition. He agreed to talk. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to reduce decades into years. Enough to shift risk upward. Enough to change Maria's life forever. Because once a man cooperates, punishment does not always land on the man. Sometimes, it lands on what he loves. By 1982, cooperation was no longer rare. It was strategic. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had begun assembling cases designed not to intimidate, but to dismantle. The blueprint would soon culminate in the historic prosecutions that targeted the leadership of the five families, cases that reshaped the structure of organized crime in America. The environment was shifting. Under the Justice Department's expanding use of RICO statutes, prosecutors were encouraged to treat organized crime as a corporate conspiracy. Indictments grew wider. Sentences grew longer. Loyalty grew fragile. Inside the Lucchese crime family, this shift was understood as existential. A soldier could endure prison. A captain could endure scrutiny. But an informant threatened architecture. Anthony was not high-ranking enough to topple a boss. But he knew enough to expose patterns. Payment channels. Meeting locations. Chains of command. And in the early 1980s, prosecutors needed patterns. What changed the calculation was not Anthony's testimony alone. It was what his cooperation symbolized. If associates began to believe survival required talking, silence would collapse from the bottom up. The leadership understood history. They remembered the destabilization caused when insiders cooperated during previous federal crackdowns. Each informant created paranoia. Each paranoia required demonstration. Public violence invited attention. Private disappearances restored order. Wives were never official members. But they were leverage. Maria had not testified. She had not spoken to authorities. But proximity in organized crime is political. Her existence represented vulnerability, a reminder that betrayal radiates outward. Inside backrooms and social clubs, conversations were measured. Calculations were cold. The message needed to be unmistakable. Cooperation does not end with the cooperator. It expands. And expansion must be stopped early. Anthony had chosen survival. The organization now had to choose precedent. Maria's final weeks in East New York were unremarkable to outsiders. Grocery runs, laundry, Sunday mass neighbors saw her, smiled, never suspected. But shadows had shifted. Surveillance was subtle. A man in a gray trench coat lingered at the corner of her street. A second car circled the block mid-morning. Mail arrived in sealed envelopes. Calls were answered, then abruptly ended. Inside her apartment, she felt it before she understood it. A missing newspaper, an unfamiliar envelope tucked between bills, a faint smell of smoke that didn't belong. Anthony, now in federal custody, could not protect her. Visits became shorter. Conversations were filtered through glass and a phone. He sensed tension, but distance distorted comprehension. The Lucchese hierarchy held meetings in rooms Maria would never enter. Decisions were deliberated over whiskey and ledger books. Soldiers and captains weighed risk and precedent. One question dominated: what to do about the wife of the cooperator? Killing her would send an unmistakable signal. Exile or relocation could fail. Too many variables, too much exposure. Internal loyalty dictated action. Bloodline vulnerability was a tool, honed over generations. Family members were often leveraged to maintain silence, to deter others from flipping. Maria had become proximity manifested. Contacts within Anthony's crew quietly assessed her routines. Neighbors who once smiled now observed, without recognition. The street, familiar, became a theater of surveillance. Every decision in these final days was calculated. Every footstep traced. In organized crime, betrayal is procedural. Execution is methodical. And the innocent often exist in the same hierarchy of consequence as the guilty. Maria did not vanish by accident. She vanished because someone at the top determined that sending a message to a cooperator required the ultimate demonstration. Her disappearance was not personal. It was operational. June 17, 1982. Dawn had broken, pale and gray over Brooklyn. Maria left her apartment like any other morning. Handbag, coat, brief hesitation at the curb. But the familiar rhythm of the street had changed. Two black sedans waited where neighbors rarely parked. One door clicked open. Witnesses reported nothing. Fear kept mouths shut. The men were professionals, disciplined, invisible in their precision. Inside the first sedan, she was forced down, restrained, silenced. The second car trailed quietly, ensuring no interruptions. There was no struggle loud enough to draw attention, no gunshots to mark the act. This was not panic. It was calculation. Bodies in the Mafia rarely stay where they fall. Brooklyn had known disappearances before: rivers, marshlands, abandoned lots. Each disposal location chosen to erase evidence, to prevent discovery, to maintain fear. The decision-makers at the top ensured that every detail reinforced hierarchy. A missing woman, not just a wife, became a signal. Cooperation carries consequences that extend beyond the individual. Neighbors would later speak of the black sedans, the unusual silence, the absence of Maria. But the operation was complete. By noon, she had ceased to exist in East New York. Mail collected, apartment swept clean, a clean erasure in the public record. For Anthony, in federal custody, the message arrived silently but unmistakably. Loyalty is conditional, and betrayal, even coerced by survival, carries a price beyond self. And for the organization, the act reinforced order. The hierarchy remained unchallenged. The system, invisible, omnipresent, ensured its own perpetuation. Murder, in this context, was not passion. It was policy. It was the enforcement of a principle older than the city itself. Silence is the currency of survival, and the cost of breaking it is exacted in full. Anthony sat in his federal cell, the metallic clang of doors punctuating every thought. He had survived the arrest, navigated interrogations, and begun cooperating. But Maria's disappearance was a new kind of sentence, one without legal recourse, one that haunted the private chambers of his mind. News of the vanishing spread quietly through Brooklyn. Whispers traveled faster than headlines. Soldiers and associates understood immediately. A cooperator's family was now a target. Loyalty had a boundary. Crossing it could mean death. Within the Lucchese crime family, tension recalibrated. Lower-tier soldiers were reminded that discretion is survival. Captains reinforced the unspoken rule: the system protects itself first, individuals second. The chain of command was unquestionable. Fear was reaffirmed as currency. Law enforcement sensed a shift too. Informants grew more cautious. The precedent of collateral consequences sent chills through those considering cooperation. Prosecutors realized that their human sources were vulnerable in ways that documentation could not anticipate. Anthony's testimony would proceed, but it would carry a shadow. Every statement he gave, every meeting he attended, was now a negotiation with mortality. He had traded years for survival, but the calculus of organized crime had claimed Maria in return. The street learned another lesson. In organized crime, loyalty is conditional, proximity is liability, and family can be as vulnerable as the accused. The message was complete. Authority was maintained. Silence remained enforced. And the world outside Brooklyn, the one watching through headlines, movies, and sensationalized stories, would never know the full cost. June 17, 1982, remains a date without resolution. Maria Salerno never returned. The black sedans never reappeared in court testimony. Her absence became a quiet punctuation mark in the narrative of organized crime. Her disappearance illuminates a principle few outsiders comprehend. Organized crime is not merely a network of men and money. It is a system that enforces obedience through proximity and vulnerability. The cooperator survives, but those he loves may not. The hierarchy is preserved not through law, but through fear meticulously applied. Anthony Salerno Jr. would go on to testify. He reduced his sentence. He lived. But the calculus was immutable. The human cost of compliance extends beyond the individual. Power, in this world, is as much about erasure as control. Silence, once broken, radiates outward like a contagion, and the system, like a surgeon, amputates the infected parts. We return to Crescent Street. The same corner Maria stepped off decades ago. The neighborhood has changed. Buildings renovated. Streets renamed. But the absence remains, intangible. The moral ambiguity is total. No justice, no spectacle, only the structural logic of survival and dominance. In the end, her story asks a question larger than Brooklyn, larger than the Salernos. What is the value of loyalty when the cost is measured not in years, but in lives? And in that silence, the system whispers the truth. In organized crime, love is leverage and fear is eternal.